In this next chapter, we're going to be discussing all of the different light types in V-Ray. As you can see in our image here, the one we're going to start with is going to be the V-Ray sphere light. Just one quick word about the V-Ray lights. It is highly recommended that you do use the V-Ray lights for most of your lighting needs. I do every once in a while still use the regular old Maya directional light. It is also okay to use the spotlight, but in general, these other light types that we're going to have available to us will fit all of the needs, and we'll be talking about how to use them to achieve some of that. So let's get started with the V-Ray, with the regular V-Ray sphere light here. And at the same time, we'll take a look at our scene, what we're going to be dealing with here. Let me turn off my grid. And you can see we've got our white cyc, we've got some boards laid out here, and there's a polygon cube underneath that we're going to be using when we talk about spherical light, or sorry, the dome light. And so for now though, we've got our two V-Ray sphere lights. And what you'll notice when you get any V-Ray light, which by the way, they're all right here under Create Light, is in our Basic Parameters tab, you can see that we have a color temperature built in, an intensity multiplier, and then selective options for these lights that are exclusive to the V-Ray settings here. And you can see one of the real main reasons that we like to use them as opposed to the regular Maya lights. You can see if I create like a Maya directional light, I can add V-Ray light attributes to it, but it's not everything that I'm going to want specifically with the temperature. So, you do still have some stuff like store the radiance map, diffuse contribution, specular contribution, but in general, it is usually a better idea to go ahead and use the built-in V-Ray lights. A prime example of this, and where you're going to be missing features, is really going to be the area light. So you can see this is actually a regular Maya area light. And if I go to Attributes V-Ray, I can add my light attributes to it. But you can see if I look at my rectangular light up here, there's a lot of different stuff that I'm really missing. Skylight portal, double-sided. You can change this rectangular light to be into a directional spotlight, which we're going to talk a little bit about. So, in general, always use those V-Ray lights. So now that's out of the way, let's go back to our sphere light here. You can see I'm utilizing the temperature, and I've got one light that's set to cool and one light that's set to warm, and that is where I'm getting that render from. Let me pull that back up. There we go. And just kind of running down the list here, you do have a radius as well, and this radius will act as a multiplier to the Maya scale. You can now, in V-Ray 3.0, go ahead and scale your light with the transforms, and that's okay. It didn't used to be okay, so you may go on the internet and you may find some information that says you're not allowed to do that, but you can. Also, you can control the number of segments in your sphere light. And then just moving down, we've got our sampling section, which is where we're going to be controlling the quality of that shadow. And this does tie directly back in to our adaptive DMC, our adaptive sampling mode. And that will just be divisible by our max subdiv. Moving down, you can see I do some other options. So most of, I have the lights on in this example, but in general, it is usually, I'm setting my light sources to be invisible. So we can turn both of those off. And then there may be certain situations where I want to control whether or not a light is actually, showing up in diffuse one way or specular another way, and I can dial these around however I see fit. So that's essentially it for the sphere light. It's really just a point light source. I'm not going to get into too crazy detail about it. It does work perfectly fine. So let's go ahead and just group those two, and we'll just call that sphere light. Let's toss that up into our light group. And now I actually have a rectangular light in here. It's the same top light that we were working with in previous scenes. So let's go ahead and do a quick render of what that looks like. So I'm going to open up my render view, IPR from my shot camera. There we go. Looks like a big, huge softbox. The rectangular light, though, does differ a little bit. This is going to be one of the spots where you can really benefit from using an actual texture. Specifically mapping a texture of a softbox into this. So let's actually we'll get a temperature going here, something a little bit, I guess, whatever we want it to be. We'll do like something really warm, like a 3200. And maybe that's a little too warm. We'll bounce it, yeah. Somewhere around in there. Cool, just dial that in. And I'm going to turn on my use rectangular checkbox. And I can also turn on multiply by the light color. So you can see this is actually a new checkbox in Vray 3. This will go ahead and take my color temperature that I have established and multiply that in through my file texture. So let's go ahead and get that mapped in, create my file texture. And I do have an HDRI in this HDRI folder for you guys. This is straight from the SIBL archive for free online. And let's just load that up. Softbox. You can see it's just a softbox texture. That's not going to really show anything too much right now in this example because I don't really have any reflective objects yet. So let's create a quick sphere. And let's go ahead and just create a new V-Ray material onto this. And we'll just make it pretty much chrome. And there you go. So you can really see now, I have a lot more texture in that light reflection. It's very cool. And that's really something that I feel is missing a lot of the time. It's really common for that to be just kind of missing, having that texture there. And so having that texture slot mapped in your rectangular light can be really, really awesome for you. So I touched on this just a second ago, but one of the really awesome benefits of our rectangular light is going to be this skylight portal. So if I turn that on, you can actually see right now we're doing absolutely nothing. What this is going to do is propagate lighting information from whatever's behind the light and focus it down into this little area. It's really amazing to take this light and put it on a window, for example, or something like that, and you can take all of the lighting information from that window and pump it in through your scene. I'm actually going to pause really quick and set up a little quick scene to use this as an example. So we'll be right back. Okay, cool. So what I've done is I've got a cube, and this cube is showing up black because I actually do have inverted normals on this cube. And I've taken my rectangular light and put it right in my window opening, I guess you could call it, in this light right here. And so I'm going to go ahead and create an actual environment. So I'm going to go to my V-Ray tab. I'm going to turn on my environment. I'm going to say override environment. I'm going to have an HDRI mapped in to my GI texture here. And I've also got a free HDRI from Dutch Skies 3D from Bob Gruthius. I'm sure I'm butchering his name, but he was kind enough to let us use this HDRI for these demos. So you can check out his website. And his website is right here. So definitely take a peek at it. Dutch 360. Really great HDRIs. A little shout out for Bob. And let me go ahead and do a quick render again. And so there we go. That's my light. Looks like I've got a little bit of artifact. I might have to work that out, but you can kind of see that we're taking all of that light information from behind and funneling it into my scene. I didn't actually show the HDRI that I was using, so I can take a quick peek at that. If we open that up. Let me get my Photoshop over here. So you can see it's just, it has some gray and some green tones in it. It's just a backyard. So let's try a different one just to kind of show this. So I can actually go ahead and load up this harbor, which is kind of like a sunset, magic hour-y kind of thing. And let's go ahead and turn on our IPR. And you can see this one's got a totally different feeling to it. So you can do some really cool stuff with this skylight portal. And just so we should talk about it really quick, there's also right below it is the simple skylight portal checkbox. Now, the simple skylight portal will actually ignore any geometry in your scene, and it will actually only propagate this environment override. So in this situation I should actually be using the simple skylight portal checkbox rather than only the skylight portal. This will make things render faster because V-Ray knows to ignore any other geo in the scene and only use that environment override instead. So, pretty cool effect. If you, just to give you an idea of what the HDRI is doing by itself without this light, we'll turn that off. And you can see it's definitely struggling to get in there and, cast that GI around. Let's just do one quick render and we'll see it with what the irradiance map can figure out. And there you go. It's a very drastic difference. You can see all of my lighting information is only coming from the GI, so the shadows are crappy quality, everything's a little bit noisy, and we're really missing out on the brightness that would be coming from that window. So cool. Let's turn our light back on. Let's get our IPR rolling again. And what I'll do in this situation for our outliner, just so you can kind of have access to these files, I'll just call this room window geo. And I'm just going to hide that now. And we'll just drag that into our geo. And then our rectangular light, I'm also going to, we'll just call that portal. And I'll hide that as well. And let's go over to my environment override and we'll just break that connection. And there we go. So now we're back to our default scene. We'll move on to our next light. Our next light is going to be we'll skip down to the V-Ray IES light. And this IES light is a photometric light, and it will do exactly what it sounds like. It will use an IES profile, and it will go in and map that to the light. So I do have one for you in the source images folder. Let's choose that. And you can see it kind of does this weird thing. It sort of snaps the light to be the actual real world scale. So if you're working at a small scale, you may need to scale this guy down. But if we kind of move that right against the wall there, and let's also turn down the intensity a little bit, you can start seeing this really beautiful shape that I'm getting. And that's really what these IES lights are all about. They have a built-in profile for them so that you can really get those really nice shapes coming down from something like a recessed light canister in a family room or something like that. You can also go online if you're doing any architecture work and an architect passes you the actual light type. A lot of time you can find the IES profile for the visualization of that light. In my case, I work in visual effects and I only use them for creative purposes because it's a very pretty, nice kind of effect. One thing to note with them is they don't really cast a perfect ray traced shadow. You can see by default I've got these nasty hard shadows. There is a little checkbox here for soft shadows. If I turn that on, it will do its best to do a ray trace shadow. But it's not perfect, and I have seen it error out a little bit, so just a word of caution. You can also notice that it doesn't have any sort of reflection that matches the size of that light. You can see on my chrome ball here, or not really chrome, but in my metal ball, it will still show up in the specular. Once I start softening that glossiness, it will still show up as a specular hit, but there's not an actual reflection like a rectangular light would have. I use them. I use these lights fairly rarely. Just so you know, it's not the greatest thing in the world, but it does come up. It comes up a lot more with architecture or very photoreal setups that I'm using. So we'll go ahead and drop this into our light group and just hide it. And now let's talk about our last light type here, which is going to be our V-Ray dome light. Actually, sorry, second to last. The V-Ray dome light is V-Ray's spherical light source, and you can see by default, it's hemispherical. There is a little spherical checkbox here. Most of the time when you're using this light source, you're going to be mapping a spherical HDRI to it, and you're not going to be using it simply for a hemispherical. So cool, let's go ahead and get this mapped. The whole point of this light is to have an HDRI in it, so let's turn one of those bad boys on. Let's turn on our use dome texture. I don't need the multiply by light color on this time. And let's map our file texture in. And we'll grab that same, we'll grab this backyard. And let's actually hide our white cyc, and we'll go down to this platform here. So our backyard is a little bit bright. You can see these are white shaders and everything, so they are going in, they're a little bit blown out. But in general, I am using the LUT on this scene again, so it is rolling off those highlights. And you can see in my reflective sphere here that we're seeing the really nice sky, and everything's working. You can also see what's really fascinating about this. Let me turn down the intensity just a touch. So I'll turn that down to like 0.5. These lights will cast physically based shadows. So that's really the beautiful thing about this dome light here. You can see in my render, I am getting these really beautiful soft shadows from that hotspot on the wall back here. You can also see that hotspot. I can point the camera up there. You can see as I kind of look up, I can see the sky, and the LUT is rolling off those highlights for me. But I'm really getting most of my light coming from that corner right up there. I've got the sun hit coming down and hitting that wall at a value of about 20 and bouncing down into my scene. And this is what I see. It's very common for me to use a light dome as my main HDRI source, and then do my look dev from that. So what's really happens very frequently is we will have an HDRI that really matches the look of a show, and I'll have a look dev environment that's really just kind of like this. It's just a polygon plane floating in space with an HDRI, and I'll just start tuning stuff because it's really easy to start tuning things like metal. Let's turn our sphere into a metal sphere here. So let's just kind of turn off our Fresnel and get that cranked up. You can already see, I can really see the way the color is interacting with that, the highlights. Maybe I can try turning on the GGX specular, and it looks pretty cool. So let's actually switch this out. Let's go over to our V-Ray light dome here, and I'm just going to, let's switch it over to, I've got this Barcelona Rooftops, which is another free HDRI from SIBL. But what's special about this is I've actually gone into Nuke, and let me open up that Nuke. I have rotoed out the sun. So this is the normal HDRI. I've rotoed out the sun, and I've actually cranked it up to a value of about, this is at 9,400. And that's a little bit closer to a physically accurate value of the sun. And it is common that you would have to do that as well, because you really can't shoot a perfect image of the sun. If you shoot it at the lowest possible ISO, and if you shoot it like f-stop of 22 for your HDRI, you may get something in the hundreds or maybe even up to 1,000. But you can see I actually needed something even higher than that. So now in my scene, again, you can, if we look out into the distance here, I can see that nice bright sun. And as I look down onto my scene, I'm getting these really amazing shadows right off that sun. I'm getting the blue light from the sky, a little bit of warmth in there from the wall behind me. It's a really gorgeous effect. So these V-Ray dome lights are really amazing for just really fast, interactive light from one of these HDRIs, and I do use them pretty frequently. They did get a pretty significant speed boost in V-Ray 3. It's worth bringing up that if you are using V-Ray 3 and coming from V-Ray 2, you'll notice they're quite a bit faster. By default, they're a little noisy, and so it is definitely worth noting where that sampling section's at right there. And just remember that you may, it's actually, I like to use this thumbnail right here. So let's actually do a quick render. So you can see there's a lot of grain down in here. It's definitely not ideal. You really will need to go in and crank up the subdivs for your final quality render for sure. Maybe even during your working, you may need to crank it up a little bit. I've had some certain situations where there's a lot of objects casting shadows that it's just almost hard to look at how noisy it is in its low setting here. So what's cool though is this sample right here does accurately reflect roughly how much noise there will be. So you can see if I set this up to 32, cleans that up much nicer, and if I do a quick render here, it looks much, much cleaner. And that's what I'm after. So the last thing I really want to touch on as far as these lights go is this store with irradiance map checkbox. You'll notice it on all of the lights, and it's an interesting little checkbox. You can see if I check it on right now with this V-Ray dome light. We'll do a quick render. My light has gone from previously being, having lighting contribution to only having GI contribution. And you can see that I've really lost the detail in my shadows. I do still have my reflection though, which is great. And I do also have, oops, not sample rate. Oh, sorry, actually, I lose my specular as well. So it changes this light from a direct light source, meaning it's casting rays, casting shadows, to an indirect light source, which means that it functions purely through this GI tab right here. There are some benefits to this. And the first and most obvious is that I can bake this out with my irradiance map. So if I'm happy with the quality that I'm getting from this, and I don't really need to have those sharp shadows from the sun, I could actually even paint out the sun in this sky and add it in myself with a directional light. But I can go in and turn on that irradiance map, store with irradiance map checkbox, and I can actually have the irradiance map hold all of that information in this kind of approximated form. You can also even turn it on with like a rectangular lights or sphere lights, and you can treat them, if they're a fill light that's not really contributing a whole lot as far as the actual shadow, it can almost end up looking better because your harsher shadow that you're getting from a direct light source becomes soft, and it can cut back on your physical rendering time after the GI pass. It will slow down your irradiance map a little bit more though. So you can kind of go in and just, as you're working, this is something you can use to dial in if you want to, and it's pretty cool. The last thing just to kind of note here is the light dome by default is going in, and it's in your color pass, and it's also affecting your alpha. I usually will have this set to invisible, and I just want it to be totally solid black out here. So you can see, and we'll turn off that store with a radiance map. So that I just get emptiness back there, and I get a proper alpha to work with. So that's about it for the light dome. And that's actually it for the physical lights. The sphere light, rectangular light, IES light, and lastly dome light. I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun with them. The next thing we're going to be talking about here is going to be light meshes in V-Ray. So I'm going to pause this here, and I'm going to hide some stuff and unhide some stuff. this file is going to be called lights physical, and this will have all the stuff. I'm going to clean it out a little bit and then load up all of the mesh light object. Cool. So onto our mesh light section here, and with our mesh light, what's going to be happening is we're going to be using a new shader called the Vray Light material, which will just, it's essentially a constant that you can assign to a mesh. But it's very, really awesome feature here. You can see I've got a little animation going here. And this is actually just a paint effect stroke that's animated. And you can see it just kind of cruise through our boards again. And this has GI turned on, and this also has physical light coming from the meshes. And you can see that's why we get this really beautiful and physical shadow. And all these shadows are moving as our light sources kind of go through the scene. So I'm going to give you this scene file to kind of play around with. And then I'm going to go ahead and talk about the light meshes. So we've got all of the paint effect stroke stuff. It was just made with an oil brush stroke, and then that geometry is baked out right here. You can kind of see it cruising through our objects. And what I've done is actually smoothed this geo. So there's a little bit of history on this because it does need to stay linked to the paint effects if I wanted to modify it. But I've held down, right click, assign new material, and I've created this one right here, Vray Light material, and it's already on here. I've got the temperature cranked down super duper low, or sorry, high, so that it's really, really cool. And you can see that I have this checkbox turned on for direct illumination. I also have my subdivs cranked up because this is the file that I rendered this from. The Vray Light material will cast GI by default. And you can actually see if I go ahead and do a quick test render with direct illumination off. I wanted to unpause this video in the middle of this render because I did want to show you just how slow this irradiance map is going. It's definitely not an easy thing for it to calculate. The mesh light will actually go quite a bit faster than this. And you can see the end result is really pretty terrible. I'm not even able to see the shadows being cast, and I've got all this splotchiness from my undersampled GI pass. And so if I open up my render settings, you can see that my GI settings are actually, they're not low. They're not high, but they're not low either. I'm set to medium animation. I've got 100 subdivs, got a little bit of interpolate samples, and I still get a result like this. So now that took 53 seconds. Let's go ahead and turn on our direct illumination checkbox, and we'll do one more quick render. I unpaused it so you can see how quickly the irradiance map just went, and now my actual render is beginning. And this is what's pretty amazing about this is it's, even though it's not exactly fast, it's a really beautiful result, and all of our shadows will be physically correct. And if I look at my GI pass is also significantly cleaner. The reason it's cleaner is because the GI pass is able to focus on the one bounce of light that's actually happening rather than treating it like a primary casting of GI light throughout the whole scene. It knows that there's already direct light and it can work off of that, and it helps it smooth out the result. So that took 49 seconds for a perfectly clean render. And that's actually what's very fascinating about this is you'll get better results using this direct illumination to do an effect like this where I have this kind of moving paint effect stroke. I did have to render the paint effect stroke separate. That's why it's set to primary visibility off and invisible right now. So when you're using these paint effects, you'll notice, or any mesh light that is, I could select this log right here with the displacement map, and I can go ahead and assign the Vray Light material to it and have that emitting light. It obeys regular render stats. So you can see if I select my pane effect stroke here, I do have my primary visibility turned off on the render stats. There's no invisible checkbox on the actual light mesh over here. You can also see that if I did want to map a file, if I wanted to map any file texture opacity, I can map that in, and I can also still have my color or temperature multiply that opacity, which is cool. Also, if you had a really heavy mesh and you wanted to emit it on backside, you can do that with that checkbox as well. So that pretty much sums it up. And you can really see, let me pull back up that render again. You'll get some really interesting and beautiful results with this. And it's a very creative effect. It almost feels like a cartoon kind of going through this in this situation, but definitely pretty cool. The V-Ray light mesh renders amazingly fast. It's really beautiful. And, you know, if you're creative about it, you can get some really, really awesome stuff out of it. So one last thing to add on the V-Ray mesh light is that there's actually a second way to create them with additional options as well. So if I go to create, and right now I do have my, let's go back to our perspective and let's get our outliner in here. Right now I do have that pane effect stroke selected, and I can go to create V-Ray, and there's actually a mesh light right here. And so you can say either turn selection into lights. Let's go ahead and create that. And you can see right here we now get a option inside of our outliner that creates a set, just like our V-Ray object properties up here. And you can see that all of the same settings are mostly here. We have intensity, subdivs, that kind of thing, and we actually even have some additional settings that are more like a regular light. In a lot of situations, this is going to be a better route to go because you can do things like skylight portal, easier to turn your light invisible, and lastly, you do sort of still have the option to do GI with the store with the radiance map. There's definitely something to be said about the ease of just assigning a material, and so I don't necessarily feel there's one way that's better than the other, but this way definitely has some additional options that are worth mentioning. You can see, just as an example, if I bounce back over to my actual shader here that we were looking at, I don't have things like specular contribution, and that can be a really major thing that you're missing. This will create those attributes that you're more used to within an actual light. So it's definitely worth mentioning that there is another way to do this. You can see you still have the option for temperature. You can map in a texture, all the same kind of stuff. So I wanted to go over some of the additional benefits to using the V-Ray mesh light set through the Create V-Ray menu. So you do have the ability now to add a new object to this set, and it will automatically inherit all of the options. So you can see if I go ahead and IPR this, our light is white now, but you can see we've got our torus here is now emitting. Looks like our stroke is invisible at the moment because we've got that primary visibility off from before. So let's turn that back on. Also looks like we've got some normals issues. So let me try unlocking the normals on that pane effect stroke. Yeah, there we go. So that was just had to fix those normals real quick. So you can see we're now getting the objects coming through, and I'm able to change any objects that we need to just by drag and dropping them into the outliner set. So you can see I could even add another object somewhere else if I wanted to. Get this cone in the center, and I can just drag that in directly into that, and then it'll grab the same settings. And now I can go in and get everything set up correctly. So let's set this to invisible. And you can also see that we need to emit on the backside of the normal as well. So I can say double-sided. There we go. So now we're bouncing more light around. We've got the backside light coming through as well. So it's looking pretty cool. And now we can go in and set the same kind of stuff, like set our temperature up around 10,000 or wherever we had it. And we can definitely start getting pretty cool effects running through using the same system, but through the Create V-Ray light mesh menu. So just another way to do it. It's pretty cool too. So that really wraps up all of the main light types in V-Ray. So on to the next chapter.